Okay, so what you can expect in the next little bit, and I'll try to make it, keep it as brief as I can. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the science of physical activity. And I'm going to talk to you about two particular areas of science that are near and dear to my heart. One are epidemiological studies, and these are big population-based studies where we try to answer big questions about what makes us healthy, what keeps us well, what makes us sick. And we have two kinds of studies. One are what we call cross-sectional studies. So these are like one point in time, we go out and we interview 2,000 people and we ask them a whole set of questions about their health and well-being. Other studies, and the studies that Brian Timmons and I are involved in, are longitudinal studies, which means we follow the same group of people over time, repeatedly asking and taking measurements on health and health-related issues. And then I'm going to show you some really fun studies from experimental work. This is where we move out of the community and the population into labs and start doing testing with equipment that we couldn't hope to bring out into big-scale studies. And I'm going to particularly show you some interesting work that started to come out in a field called cognitive psychology about the link between exercise and physical activity and what it actually does to our brains. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about acting on the knowledge that we have. But there's people in the room today that are much better placed than I am to talk about how we take this knowledge and do something good with it. But before we go any further, I want to be clear that we understand what we're talking about when we talk about physical activity. Because, in fact, we're usually talking about a bunch of different activities that are all part of the definition of physical activity. The broadest definition of physical activity is it's just any movement of the body that results in energy expenditure. So all that skiing you were doing a little while ago was moving those big muscle groups in your body, and you were expending energy above that which you would if you were just sitting on your bum listening to what was going on. But when we think about the different kinds and types of physical activity, we have things like exercise, which is where we intentionally move our bodies to achieve a goal, like increase our fitness or make us feel better. But it also includes things like active transportation. So how we get to and from school, how we get to and from work, what we do to get to our friends and families' houses on the weekend. Do we ride a bike? Do we take a car? The difference in the kinds of active transport options that we have make a difference for our health and well-being. And then, of course, there's recreational physical activity, and that can include things like sports, although if you're an ex-CFL football player, you were doing it for money, but most of us don't do sports for money. Most of us aren't that good, but we do sports for fun. And we ride bikes, and we do other kinds of activities. Skiing are all part of recreational activities. And then there's habitual physical activity, which is just the things that we do every single day that we're not even aware of, like standing up and walking to the bathroom, doing household chores and vacuuming and cleaning and things like that are also forms of physical activity. And then depending on what kind of job you have, you may be very physically active or very, very sedentary. But this is just to give you a sense of all of the things that we're talking about when we talk about physical activity. So let's not just think about it in terms of sport. Let's think about all the different ways in which we can move our bodies and expend energy. Now, let me tell you something you already know. Physical activity is good for you. All of those things that we listed a moment ago are good for you. They can help you control body weight. They can help you lose weight. They build strong muscles and bones. It strengthens your heart muscle, builds lung capacity, it improves the health of your arteries. Your arteries become more elastic and allow blood to flow more easily, which helps regulate your blood pressure. All of these things improve physical health and reduce the risk of things like heart disease years and years into the future. Many, many forms of cancer and other chronic health problems have all been shown to be reduced by engagement in physical activity over a prolonged period. How much of this do you need to do in order to get the health benefits? Well, I made some assumptions about the ages of people in the room. So these are guidelines. You can get these guidelines from Participaction, Health Canada. You can get it from the CESP website. But basically, you should be aiming for 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every single day. We should be shooting to accumulate 150 minutes of physical activity a week. But we can do it in small bouts. We can do it in 10-minute increments. So how long did we ski for? It's probably about 5 or 6 minutes, maybe even close to 10. Brian really likes to push the envelope. So, maybe we already got the first 10-minute bout of physical activity today that we need. And you should try to add muscle and bone strengthening. So doing some weights and flexibility and stretching are good things to do on at least 2 days a week. Now, what do we mean by moderate intensity? Well, moderate means you're going to get a little bit sweaty, your heart rate's going to go up, and your breathing is going to be a bit harder. And if those things aren't happening, you're not doing moderate intensity level physical activity. Right? And vigorous would just be that all of those things keep on increasing. You're going to get even sweatier, your heart rate's going to go up even more, and you're going to find it hard to talk sometimes because you're breathing so hard. So we use these things as behavioral cues to let people know this is how you know you're getting something of value. So taking a nice stroll with your friends is great, but if your heart rate's not getting up, if you're not breathing harder, you're not getting that at least moderate intensity level physical activity that we need to reap the health benefits that we know exist. But so what if he says that that's so? Well, you want evidence, right? Good for you, you should. You should ask, what is the state of evidence about the importance of physical activity? Well, I could spend the rest of the day showing you research results. I'm going to handpick a few that I'm particularly interested in. The first one is by a colleague of mine, Peter Kaczmarek. He used to be at Queen's University, but now he's down south in the US. He's done a number of what we call those longitudinal population-based health surveys, so following the same group of people over a long, long period of time. And it was called the aerobics study, aerobic-centered study. And most of our understanding of the long-term health outcomes actually come from that database. What you're looking at here are two graphs. The darker bars are all-cause mortality. So that's anyone who died in the study for whatever reason. Could have been heart disease, could have been cancer, could have been of natural causes, whatever. It's all causes of death. And then the grayer bars are cardiovascular disease. Now, what's interesting to me about these results is that these are all men who had metabolic syndrome. Anybody know what metabolic syndrome is? That means they could have been diabetic, had hypertension, had high levels of cholesterol. In other words, these are men who would have had major risk factors for cardiovascular disease, would have increased the likelihood that they would have a heart attack or a stroke way above the normal population. And what's cool is the way these graph bars go from large to small are actually showing you what the death rate, what the mortality rate were for men with metabolic syndrome by their fitness level. So the biggest bars were men who were not physically fit. They had very low levels of physical fitness. Combined with the metabolic syndrome, they were dying at 3 times the rate of the smallest bars, which are the men who had really high levels of physical fitness, even though they were hypertensive and diabetic and had other risk factors for heart disease. So the good news in this is that if you're born with risk for hypertension because of your genetic background, because of where your family, the group, where you come from, if you're genetically programmed to have higher levels of cholesterol or more likely to be diabetic, you can cut the odds of premature mortality by being physically active and increasing your physical fitness levels. So it's important for everyone, and it's particularly important for people who have existing risk factors. We can't do anything about our genetics, but we can do a lot about our behavior. Here's another study that came out just about a year ago or a couple years ago on how much physical activity we actually need in the population to make a difference. Now, I've already given you the guidelines about 60 minutes a day, and that's what I would recommend that you follow. But even limited amounts of physical activity can have a positive effect. So here's a big population study that was done in Taiwan. Over 400,000 men and women, followed them from 1996 to 2008, so about an 8-year period. And again, they tracked the number of people that died and the factors that were associated with death in that particular study. And here's what they found on physical activity, that even 15 minutes per day of moderate intensity physical activity reduced mortality by 14%. So to put that in a more meaningful number, on average, those people who were exercising for at least 15 minutes a day or getting physical activity for 15 minutes a day lived 3 years longer than people who were sedentary, who didn't exercise. And if you double that to a half an hour, then you reduce overall mortality rates in the population by 20%. So if you're going for the 60 minutes, good for you. You're going to get maximal heart health benefit. But even increasing your physical activity a little bit can have a positive impact. Now, Brian's already mentioned this. It's not just about physical activity. It's about what we have to face every single day in the environment in which we have created. Think about your day. Think about what you're doing right now. And by the way, you have my permission to stand up. You can stand up, you can walk to the back of the room. Please don't feel like you have to sit for the whole time and listen to me. I'm not going to do a skiing intervention, but I want you to stand up if you feel that you'd be more comfortable. Because a lot of us have to sit down for long periods of time during the day, whether we're in a car, whether we're watching television or at a computer, or whether we're sitting in a classroom at desks. And you know, some pictures of sedentary behavior can be quite cute, like this fat little cat, but in fact, sitting for long periods of time is deadly. Brian said it already. Sedentary behavior is really fast becoming the new smoking in terms of public health concerns. What about some data? What do we have in studies to support that? Well, we've got a number and a growing number of studies about how bad sedentary behavior actually is for us. Here's a US study, over 7,000 men, and look at the rates where they were reporting 10 or more hours in a car. They had an 82% higher rate of dying from cardiovascular disease. So they were more likely, 82% more likely, if they spent 10 or more hours in a car sitting. If you look at cumulative sedentary behavior, which is not just sitting in a car, but sitting at a desk or watching television, those same men, or men rather, who had more than 23 hours a week of combined sedentary behavior had a 64% increased risk of dying for cardiovascular disease. What does that mean for you? Well, if you think about how you get to and from work and school every day, most people in the province of Ontario, the average commute is 35 to 60 minutes. And that's whether you're taking a bus, public transportation, or car. So if you're at the low end, if you're at that 30 minutes, that means you're racking up 5 hours a week just sitting in a car. If your commute ups to an hour, you're actually in that risk zone. You're spending 10 hours or more in a car, you're in a risk area. If you look at how much, or think about how much time you spend sitting at your desk in a week, or watching TV, or sitting at school, 4 hours a day puts you at 20 hours a week. 5 hours a day puts you at 25 hours a week. If you add it all up, you can see that it doesn't take too quick to get to that 23 magic number of 23 hours sitting, where your risk for heart disease and cardiovascular death goes up significantly. This is a big problem. Do we have any Canadian data? Yeah, we do. There was a study done back in the 1980s called the Canadian Fitness Survey. It's followed 16,000, more than 16,000 Canadians, 18 years of age to 90. And that data was linked to mortality databases. And when we went back and we looked at the number of times, or how much time a person spent standing, so this is not sitting, this is standing, how much time they spent standing in their occupation, we found, or rather Peter Kaczmarek found, strong associations between the number of hours that you spend standing and your risk of death. Again, if you look at those bar charts, the white bars are people who are sitting or not standing most of the day. Whether you're a man or a woman, your risk for mortality goes up significantly. The more time you spend standing, which is the black bars at the end, the lower your overall risk for death. So what are the solutions in all of this? Pretty simple. Sit less, stand more, and increase the amount of physical activity in every single day in your lives. Teachers in the classroom, let's start thinking about standing desks, standing workstations, walking meetings. My lab group has walking meetings. We have walking brainstorming meetings. When we want to think about new problems or think through complex problems, we get up and we move around. Oh, and by the way, the research actually shows that you can increase productivity anywhere from 10% or more by allowing people to get up and stand and move around and not be confined to sitting. There's a bunch of reasons why that is, and I'll show you in a moment. We actually now have sedentary behavior guidelines in this province and in Canada, which suggests for youth 12 to 17 years of age that you shouldn't spend any more than 2 hours a day sitting in front of a screen, whether it's a TV, a computer screen, or your handheld device. You need to limit the amount of time that you're in a sedentary position looking at screen time. So what about this brain studying and exercise connection? You know, the part of the talk that I said we're going to have a big test and so we need to hit the gym. There's a growing body of literature on physical activity in the brain, and it shows a number of interesting things. The first one is that physical activity and exercise isn't just about heart health. Physical activity and exercise is good for stress. It reduces stress. It reduces symptoms of depression and anxiety. So in other words, physical activity and exercise is good for your mental health as well as your physical health. And there's a growing body of work that shows that it's specifically good for aspects of brain functioning. So it positively impacts on things like memory, concentration, attention, what we call inhibition, which is the ability to ignore things and pay attention and focus when we need to pay attention and focus, and self-regulation, which my colleague would have spoke about this morning, which is our ability to control ourselves and our own behavior. So here's the connection I was trying to make. If you're studying for an exam, that can be really stressful. And at least two things can happen, possibly. Prolonged, unmanaged stress can lead to what we call feelings of distress, symptoms of anxiety, anxiousness, feelings of sadness. Stress in other areas of our life can also be sources that affect our feelings of stress and our experience of distress when we have to face things in life like exams and challenges with school. And when we're distressed, our brain function is compromised. And that affects our capacity to learn. It affects our ability to memorize things. It affects our ability to problem solve. And it affects our ability to be creative. Very, very important aspects of the learning process. So I'm going to suggest to you that physical activity and exercise is a great way to cope with stress and distress. But I'm not just going to tell you that. I'm going to show you why. Anxiety, feelings of anxiousness. Now, anxiety is an interesting thing. We often feel anxiety in our bodies. We can feel it through elevated heart rate. We can feel it by getting sweaty and clammy. We can feel it by butterflies in our stomach. But it's also negative thoughts in our heads and other things that make us feel anxious. If you have those feelings, if you've experienced that before, you are not alone. About 29 or even 30% of the population at some point in their life has a significant issue with anxiety. And the psychiatric literature, the psychiatrists and the psychologists talk about different kinds of anxiety, and I've listed some of them there. Generalized anxiety disorder is just feeling generally anxious about things. Panic disorder. Has anyone ever had a panic attack before? I had a panic attack. I've had a couple, actually. When I was a university student, I had one when I was a high school student in grade 13. I thought I was going to die. That's the feeling. It's this overwhelming feeling of something bad is going to happen to me. And it's a terrifying experience. Agoraphobia, that's a mouthful. What it basically means is you're afraid to go outside or you're afraid to be with other people. And oftentimes it comes about because you've had a panic attack. If you've had a panic attack, for example, in a public place, you sometimes don't want to go back to that place because you're worried you're going to feel that same sensation again. The more panic attacks you have, the more likely you are to start avoiding the places that make you feel really, really anxious. Post-traumatic stress disorder, something that's very commonly experienced by our frontline workers, by our military, people who have experienced, by people in every day, all walks of life, who've experienced trauma or really negative things, often can't shake the feelings that they had when they experienced that trauma, and it stays with them for a long period of time. I could go on. Phobias, there's 1,000 of them. We all have funny phobias, like we might be afraid of spiders, and we can deal with that pretty effectively. But some of these other disorders can be quite debilitating and really leave us feeling quite poorly and compromise our schoolwork and our relationships and our work life. What do we know about the causes of anxiety or distress? Well, there's a bunch of things. Some of them are genetic, some of them are behavioral. But stress is a really, really important risk factor for anxiety. If you're under a lot of stress, and you're under a lot of stress for a long period of time, your risk of having a panic attack, your risk of feeling anxious or even depressed increases significantly. And there was a very famous researcher a number of years ago who described this process as a stress process model. It looked at stress exposure being a risk factor for depression and anxiety, but we know that not everybody who's exposed to stress develops symptoms of anxiety and depression. Many people can cope with stress quite well, and coping skills, being able to problem solve, being able to think through experiences that you're having and compartmentalize them, having friends and loved ones around you are all examples of things that we say buffer stress. So when those things are present, and you experience a stressful event, it's less likely to negatively impact you when you've got friends and loved ones and when you've got some ideas about how to cope with stress. Because, of course, not all stress is bad. We need a little bit of stress. I know when I was a student, I needed a little bit of stress in order to be motivated to study. Where it gets problematic is when the stress becomes too intense. Then we become debilitated. We shut down. We can't function well. So we all need a little bit of stress. Brian needed a little bit of stress to get up for a big game. But he couldn't be so stressed out that he felt like he couldn't go on the field, because then he wouldn't be able to do what he needed to do. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that we have evidence that shows that physical activity can positively impact the whole stress process. Physical activity is actually a coping strategy for dealing and managing with stress. Physical activity is a way of reducing stress directly and reducing feelings of anxiety and depression directly. So again, much like physical activity is a panacea for, I hope I didn't shut something down there. Looks like I did. Just like physical activity is what we call almost a magic pill for cardiovascular disease and depression. I'll move over here. Physical activity is a magic pill for distress and anxiety in this whole stress process. Looks great, thank you. I promise I won't touch it again. So we have evidence from what we call meta-analyses. Now let me tell you really quickly what a meta-analysis is. When you're a scientist and you do a study and you write up a paper, you have it published in a journal or in a book. A meta-analysis is when somebody takes all of the studies, or as many of the studies as we can find on a particular topic area, and combines all the results together. So in medicine, we think of a meta-analysis as the highest form of evidence, because it's not just studies that were done in my lab, it's studies that were done all over the world. And we take all that information and pool it together and say, what does this body of work, what do all of these studies tell us about an association? So there have been a number of meta-analyses on the association between physical activity, exercise, depression, and anxiety. And all of them show that the more exercise, the more physically active you are, the more you will get a reduction in symptoms of depression and anxiety. And even in some cases, prevent depression and anxiety from occurring in the first place. So just like cardiovascular disease, we've got strong evidence that physical activity and exercise is important for our mental health. How does that happen? Well, there's a number of different ways, and I won't go into detail, but there's physiological stuff that's happening. Physical activity alters brain chemistry, and it alters brain chemistry in chemicals like serotonin, which have been shown to be linked to depression and anxiety. So it acts directly on our brain the same way that a lot of the medications that we use to treat anxiety and depression act on our brain. In fact, there was a recent meta-analysis which showed that exercise and physical activity was as effective as medication for treating anxiety. Of course, there's a psychological dimension to this. Physical activity can be a really good form of distraction. When you're studying for that test, you've been studying for a few hours, you're starting to feel tired, you're starting to feel fatigued, you're starting to feel stressed out. Go for a run or do whatever it is that you need to do to release some of that, get some of that energy back and release some of that tension. Because there's a good chance that while you're doing that activity, you're not going to be thinking about your exam, you're going to be thinking about something else. And distraction is a powerful mechanism for dealing with stress. We know exercise increases our sense of control. When Brian has you put your finger up and says, I am change, I'm part of that is taking control, taking ownership. And physical activity, when we achieve things through physical activity and exercise, makes us feel generally good about ourselves, like we have more control than we thought we did. And of course, there's a social element. If you can work out or if you can play sports with other people, that's powerful because there's a social element to it. And we are social creatures. We're programmed to be social creatures. It can be a source of motivation. Are you going to the gym today? I'm not sure. I don't really feel like it. Come on, man, let's go. It can be that sort of level of motivation and support, but it can also be sharing things physical with other people, which is shown to be important. We did a study where we looked at a national survey of Canadians, almost 37,000 Canadians, aged 15 years and older. And on that survey, there were a bunch of questions about how people cope with stress, and there were 13 different ways. Some of them were really positive, like physical activity and exercise. Some were negative, like taking drugs or smoking or drinking alcohol. Only 40% of Canadians in our survey indicated that they used physical activity to relieve stress. And of those 13 behaviors, it was ranked 8th overall. Yet, we know it's so effective for coping with stress, and most of us don't use it. Now, the good news is, if you're younger and you're in high school, you're more likely to use physical activity or exercise to deal with stress. But don't get too cocky, because we did another study where we looked at participation in physical activity over time, and what we see, which is consistent with other studies, is that physical activity levels decline from the time you're about 12 to the time you're in your early 20s. And the extra lines here on these graphs, the solid lines, just show the boys and girls or the young men and women in our study who went on to post-secondary education. It was great for young girls. If they went on to university or college, they tended to stay relatively physically active. But the girls who didn't stopped participating in physical activity. For boys, it was about the same. The disconcerting thing in all of this is that it's going down for everybody. And it continues to go down over time, a trend that we desperately need to stop. Is physical activity and exercise, it's good for your mental health, it's good for your physical health. Does it help you with your schoolwork? Is there any evidence around the importance of physical activity for academic achievement? And the answer is yes. Here's another one of those meta-analyses, right? Pooling together results from a whole bunch of different studies. And it turns out physical activity and exercise is associated with IQ. It's associated with grades and school achievement, both in standardized tests and in schoolwork. It increases verbal ability. It increases mathematic ability. It increases school readiness. So even among young children entering into kindergarten, the more active they are, the more ready they are to participate and succeed at school. Is there a specific role for physical education in this? Yes, there is. The literature is a little complex in this area, but there was a famous study that was done in Canada a number of years ago by Roy Shepard that showed you could replace 240 minutes of academic class time per week with structured physical activity and improve grades, which seems a little counterintuitive. Let's take away class time where there's academic component going on and go down to the gym and do some structured physical activity. How could that possibly raise grades? But it did. There was a CDC study that showed a correlation between teachers' reported time in physical education and students' academic achievement. Interestingly, the correlation was stronger for girls than it was for boys. I think part of the reason that you can do these kinds of interventions and show improvements in grades is because we know that physical activity and exercise is related to brain functioning, and specifically cognition, which is a general term that psychologists use to describe mental abilities, things like knowledge that we have, memories, reasoning, and problem solving. And there's a growing literature suggesting that exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, which is that moderate to intense level of physical activity, improves cognitive ability. And it does it early in life, right through the life course to the very oldest in our population. One really important area of this is called cognitive control. And cognitive control, sometimes referred to as executive functioning or executive control, is, again, a set of mental abilities that are essential for learning and development. Inhibition or inhibitory control, which is that, again, that sense that I can stay focused on a task. My attention is there and I can stay focused. Working memory is my ability to hold a bunch of information in my head while I'm working on a problem. Cognitive flexibility is I can do this talk right now and think about what I'm going to make for dinner tonight. I can do a bunch of tasks simultaneously and hold that information in my brain. Those things, if they're present, are the necessary conditions and building blocks for learning. Now, as researchers, we're always looking for ways to get inside your head. And it turns out one of the more powerful ways, and less expensive ways, frankly, is to capitalize on the fact that your brain is constantly sending out little electronic signatures. And what this fellow is wearing on his head are a bunch of electrodes. And normally what we do is actually use a swimming cap and have a bunch of electrodes that we put right over the head. And each of those tiny little circles is able to pick up on a specific region of the brain and capture when a neuron is firing or a set of neurons are firing. And it produces what we call a signature, and it looks like those squiggly lines. When a certain area of your brain is active, it sends out a little electrical signature, and we can pick that up and we can measure it. Now let me show you some studies that have done using that technology, looking at electrodes and looking at those electronic signatures and looking at the impact of exercise on brain functioning. So here's an interesting little study, all pre-adolescent children. I think there were 40 of them, if I remember correctly. And they had a single bout of moderate physical activity. They did 20 minutes on a treadmill at 60 or 70% of their max heart rate. So again, at that breathing a little bit hard, getting sweaty, that whole moderate definition we had a moment ago. But the group was divided into two. A group of kids who were having difficulty with what we call inhibitory control. These are kids who might be ADD, ADHD, have problems with attention and have problems focusing. And the other group didn't have those problems. Now the areas here are a picture of what's happening when all those areas of the brain are firing when we have these kids do a set of cognitive tests. And what you see on the top are the two groups at rest. The two heads on top, the one with more shaded area, are the high performers. These are the kids who don't have problems with inhibition and attention. The low performers are the ones where the area of the brain is much smaller. The top is what happens when they're at rest, so they haven't worked out yet. What do you see? The kids who don't have inhibitory control problems or problems with attention, their brains are working harder and responding in ways that are consistent with problem solving and learning. And the kids that have the inhibitory control problems are struggling with the tasks. Now look at the pictures on the bottom. That's after the same children have had 20 minutes of physical activity. Just one bout of 20 minutes of moderate physical activity. Much more areas of the brain are lit up now. More areas of the brain are working. More signals suggesting problem solving. And it's different for both groups, but look at the difference for the kids that have attentional difficulties. The take-home message is they benefit even more than the kids who don't from physical activity. So when you pick up the Globe and Mail or you go online and you see things like physical exercise and physical activity is a treatment for attention deficit disorder or ADHD, there's the data to support it. It actually compensates for cognitive challenges that kids have. Same group of researchers went back and did an after-school intervention program for kids 7 to 9 years of age. 1 hour every day after school, structured physical activity intervention program, 221 kids. Just like our Start2Finish kids, everybody's fitness improved. But look at the brain pictures about the kids that improved in terms of cognitive performance. The intervention groups are the groups, so those are the kids that got the 1 hour every day. Those are the heads that show all the bright colors and areas of the brain that are lit up. The kids that didn't get the intervention, what they call waitlist, are the ones that have much smaller regions. The added hook, if you will, in this study is that the brains on the bottom were the kids that were given a more complex test than the kids on the top. So again, what it's showing is that this is good not only for general cognitive improvement, but it's good when you have a really challenging problem. So all kinds of positive things are happening in the brain on just single moment intensity activities for physical activity, but also when we have prolonged exposure to physical activity. Now I'm wrapping up. The challenge here is not a lack of knowledge or evidence. I hope that I've convinced you now, if you needed convincing, that the science is pretty clear on this. We don't need really more studies with lit up brains and epidemiological studies showing reduced risk of heart disease. As much as I love doing those studies, we don't need more. The challenge is not more evidence. The challenge is acting on what we know. We know we need to increase physical activity. We know we need to decrease sedentary behavior. The health and social benefits are many. It's not just about heart health. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, really the question is, what are we going to do about it? And the good news is, it's not something that we need to do on our own. In fact, it's something we can't do on our own. Everybody has an important role to play, but it's so much more powerful if we act as a group. Start2Finish is a big part of that solution, and that's why I'm involved with this group. You've heard of Spark, you may have heard of Catch. This is starting to take hold in the minds and the consciousness of educators and leaders across the country, that this is really, really important, that we can do something collectively. Now, the challenges that we have, though, is that changing behavior is really, really hard. Exercise and physical activity can be really, really hard. And there are individual level factors like motivation that affect people's ability to be active. But there are also environmental and social factors. Environment are things like, do we have the spaces and the equipment and the expertise that we need in order to make these programs work? And the economic ones are significant. Do we have the money to run these programs? Do we have money to provide infrastructure and to provide resources for kids and for others to participate? That's another reason why I like Start2Finish, because Start2Finish doesn't see physical activity and exercise interventions as separate from social factors. In fact, they see it as a way of positive social change, and that's a powerful message. You know, I went to the website and I noticed they stole the Margaret Mead quote, and you've probably seen it before. I almost feel a little silly talking about it because it's so commonplace, but it is so powerful, right? Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Here's some other quotes you may be less familiar with, though, that I like. Change almost never fails because it's too early. It almost always fails because it's too late. And act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about what we do, go to www.inchlab.ca and look at some of the studies that we have. And if you're really socially media savvy, you can like us on Facebook. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope there was something of value and of interest to you in this stuff.